Hi, it's Alex. Let's take a look at Mark 4:26 through 29 as an example of the Bible arcing method, and with particular focus today on the relationship of progression, to look at that together as an example in this text. So let me read Mark 4:26 to 29 for you here. The kingdom of God is as if a man should scatter seed on the ground, Jesus said. He sleeps and rises night and day, and the seed sprouts and grows, he knows not how. The earth produces by itself first the blade, then the ear, then the full grain in the ear. But when the grain is ripe, at once he puts in the sickle, because the harvest has come. So the first thing we want to do when we read a passage, if we're going to arc it together, we want to break this passage up into its various propositions. And let me show you how I broke this passage up into its various propositions down here below. First of all, I kept this opening sentence as one proposition. You could probably break this up technically into two verbal assertions. The kingdom of God is, that is a verbal assertion. And then we do have a comparison here, as if a man should scatter seed on the ground. However, one of the things that I've noticed about Jesus' parables is that he often, it's not always, but he often introduces his parables with one opening sentence in which the whole parable is kind of encapsulated, and then he expands on that. It's sort of in an idea and explanation kind of way. So a lot of times when I'm arcing something like this, you could right here think in terms of, and he sleeps and rises night and day. The kingdom of God is as if a man should scatter seed on the ground, and he sleeps. So you could just make it a simple series. But I tend to see this as encapsulating in some way a statement upon which he expands in the rest of the parable. We see something similar, like if you think of some of the other parables that Jesus shared, like when he said a man was giving a dinner and invited many people, and then that sets the stage for the whole parable. Or two men went up to the temple to pray, a Pharisee and a tax collector. And the whole parable is kind of encapsulated in that sentence. Or probably most famously, a man had two sons. The whole parable that we refer to often as the parable of the prodigal son is actually a parable about a man who had two sons, and it's all encapsulated in that first sentence. So here I'm going to stick with keeping this first sentence as one verbal assertion, one proposition, which reminds me that this parable really has one point, even though there's certainly lots of things. We can say more than just one thing about any of the parables, but it has one main point that's encapsulated in this first sentence. So that's my first proposition. My second proposition is here, and you have some choices you could make in regard to these next few phrases. You could say, technically, he sleeps, and you could have a separate conjunction there, a key word, and he rises, night and day. However, as I read over this, what the rhythm that he seems to be introducing is a man who sleeps and rises night and day. That's his activity. And then we have the activity of the seed, and the seed sprouts and grows. It seems to be pointing to a progression of events that are happening in a repetitive cycle over and over as the seed is growing. And so this is how, for better or for worse, this is how I broke these propositions up. He sleeps and rises night and day, and the seed sprouts and grows, he knows not how. This is joined by the semicolon. Then in verse 28, the earth produces by itself, and then we have this progression. First the blade, then the ear, then the full grain in the ear. And we have these words, then, setting those off in a progression relationship. But when the grain is ripe, at once he puts in the sickle, because the harvest has come. So I'm going to start at the beginning and think about the relationships within these propositions. And where my eye goes first is right here to verse 26, as I said, kind of encapsulates the whole parable that then he expands on. So I'm going to label this as an idea, and I'm going to draw an arc over the whole rest of these arcs and label this as an explanation of this first idea that's introduced in verse 26. So I can work from the top down and look at the overarching relationship here before I get into the weeds of each of these propositions. But then I can look at verse 27 and think about the relationships here. And what I see here is a progression of events that include the man and the seed that he has scattered, that he's planted. He sleeps and rises night and day, and the seed sprouts and grows, and he knows not how. And this phrase, he knows not how, really, I take it as, maybe I could rephrase it as, and he is none the wiser. Because all the fruit that's happening under, all the development that's happening under the ground, he can't see it, is kind of the point. He's going about his days and his weeks. He's doing his thing. And under the soil, the seed is doing its thing. And so we have what I think is a progression of events here that are leading to this point right here. He sleeps and rises night and day. The seed sprouts and grows, and he knows not how. He's none the wiser. Which points us back to the point in verse 26 that the kingdom of God is as if a man should scatter seed. That's all encapsulated right there. This man, he scattered the seed. He's going about his day, but at the end he doesn't have any idea how, or he's not making the seed do what only the seed can do. That is, sprout and grow. And so we have a progression that highlights that reality and leads to this truth. If we said all of these steps but left out this final one, the parable wouldn't be going anyplace. We wouldn't be learning anything as Jesus walked through this parable. But he gives us these steps in order to lead to this point. It progresses here to the reality that he doesn't gain any knowledge about what the seed is doing. The seed has to do it by itself. And that's exactly what he goes on to say in verse 28, that the earth produces by itself first the blade, then the ear, then the full grain in the ear. And I see something parallel happening here to what we saw about the idea and explanation, that we have this main idea that the earth produces by itself. This by itself principle is very important and central to this whole parable. The earth produces by itself, and so then we have this progression that is the explanation of what he means by the earth produces by itself. And we have another progression of these three statements. First the blade, then the ear, then the full grain in the ear. The maturity of the grain is the point of all this activity here, of how the earth produces by itself. First the blade, then the ear, then the grain in the ear. So I'm going to draw this arc under the idea and the explanation. And then it's this progression of these three, first the blade, then the ear, then the grain in the ear. And that leads me down to verse 29. But when the grain is ripe, at once he puts in the sickle, because the harvest has come. And so the first thing I see is this but, which points us probably to an alternative relationship. But the second thing I see is this word when, this temporal language. This is the conditions, or the time, the season, in which he puts in the sickle. It's the harvest that has come. So this idea of temporal, so I'm going to label this as temporal in relationship. Whoops. And then we have this word because, which points to the relationship of ground. When the grain is ripe, at once he puts in the sickle. Why? Why does he put in the sickle when the grain is ripe? Because the reason, or the ground of that action, is that the harvest has come. So I'll label this as a ground, draw my arc over that. And then I can begin to ask, what is the relationship then? I've identified this idea and explanation of the whole passage, this whole parable, this progression of thought right here of what's happening, in which the man who scatters the seed still does not know how the seed does what it does, because the earth produces by itself first the blade, then the ear, then the full grain. So another progression of an idea and an explanation here. So then what is the relationship between 27 and 28 and 29 under this arc? And the first thing that I see is right here, the relationship between 26 or between 27 and 28. That this relationship right here seems to me to be a ground relationship. That this man goes through this progression of activity, and he still doesn't know how, because or for the earth produces by itself first the blade, then the ear, then the full grain in the ear. It's not that the man is doing anything after he has scattered the seed. He's not contributing to the growth of the seed. The seed is doing this of itself. The earth is doing this work of itself, or the earth and the seed in tandem is producing this fruitfulness. So I see this as a ground, first of all, here in verse 28, a ground as the reason why verse 27 is true. And then the relationship right here in verse 29, signaled by the word but, an alternative relationship. He doesn't know how. He's none the wiser, because the earth is producing this by itself. This is really central to Jesus' parable, this by itself principle. The earth is producing by itself first the blade, then the ear, then the full grain in the ear. Nevertheless, but he benefits in the harvest. Even though he can't explain how this all happens, and in some ways it doesn't depend on him other than scattering that seed, nevertheless he benefits in the harvest. And that points us to the relationship then that we've already given the arc here between these two arcs here as an alternative relationship, that he sleeps and rises night and day, and yet he does not know how the seed is producing grain, because the earth is doing it by itself. First the blade, then the ear, then the full grain in the ear. But he still puts in his sickle when the grain is ripe, because the harvest has come. And so this is how I would arc this passage in Mark 4:26-29. And I hope you've seen an example, a couple examples, of the use of the relationship, particularly of progression, in this passage.